All right, so we'll get started. My name is Heather Chadwell Dennis. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Pupil Services here in the Beacon City School District. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to go through what the annual review process is, some things you can expect, and then provide resources at the end. So I'm co-hosting with Micah Danchek, who works in our technology department. Thank you very much, Mike, for assisting through this. He will be working on controlling the slides. So Mike, if you could show the first one. Great. So tonight, what we are going to do is review the annual review process. And this session will explain what to expect during the Committee on Special Education meetings. It will be very similar for preschool as well, if you'll be having preschool meetings with us. How to prepare for those meetings, how to effectively advocate for your child and what your child may need. And tonight we'll cover key topics such as what does progress monitoring mean toward goals? We'll look at what new goals are and how to discuss support services that may be offered to your child. Next slide. So we have a lot to cover in 30 minutes. So I will present a slide on who our team is so that you know who might be with you at a meeting. We'll talk about what is an annual review, why do we hold them and who attends them. We'll talk about what to prepare before the meeting occurs because the meetings are usually about 45 minutes, so to be ready for that preparation. What happens during the meeting, how we discuss your child's strengths and areas that are of challenge. What does progress measuring look like and how we celebrate that? And then understanding the present levels of performance we'll go through as well, often called the PLEPs. If you're talking with someone, it's often called the PLEPs. We'll talk about goal setting, service decisions, what does the least restrictive environment mean, some transition coordination considerations for our older kiddos, what you can expect after the meeting, and then some resources. Next slide. So let's introduce the team. So I'm Heather Chadwell Dennis. I'm the assistant superintendent here. I may be chairing your child's meeting, and it really has to do with availability and familiarity. So you'll see in a minute the number of meetings that we'll be holding, and we want to make sure that all are completed in an efficient time manner. So Christina Bartley is our Assistant Director for Pupil Services. She chairs our meetings predominantly at the middle and the high school, and you may see her chairing some 5th grade meetings as well. But again, we have a lot of meetings to ensure are completed before the end of June. So although she does secondary, you may see her in some elementary meetings occasionally. Angela Sturbins is one of the CSE chair people here. She's mostly doing our elementary meetings. She may be doing some out of district. And Jane Servone, who you may know, who is a teacher here in the district and has retired, she is supporting us for our preschool meetings and may be doing the transition meeting into kindergarten. Some other individuals that you may see, these are all school psychologists in our building and all are approved to chair meetings as well. Allison Byback, Angela Zappala, Roberta Clemens, Donna Suma, and Nick DeMarco. Next slide. So our support team is vast. So Terry Betancourt is supporting the clerical side for preschool. Jen Master-Nicola is our clerical side for elementary. Dana Quintana for our secondary. Suzanne DeCastro, you may hear because of scripts that we might need. She works with our billing. And then Joan Edmondson works directly with me. We also have Esther here with us, Delgado. She's also here supporting as we are seeking to add an additional staff member. Next slide. So what is an annual review? Next slide, Mike. So an annual review is required one time a year, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an annual review. It just means that we have to meet one time annually to review your child's individualized education program. And the purpose is to review the progress, look at the goals, and then ensure that the IEP has met the students' needs this year and tailor it for the next year. Next slide. So this spring, excluding preschool meetings, we have about 130 preschool meetings that will be held because we are responsible for children ages 3, so usually around 2 years, 11 months, through 21. So we will be holding 589 annual reviews this spring. So we work really hard to be efficient and ensure that you have all the information that you need and the teachers have all the information that they need so that we can plan for 859 programs for the next school year. Next slide. I said 859, at 589. I apologize. So who attends the annual review meeting? Next slide. So these are people that you typically would see in a meeting. So always we invite the parents or guardians, and you are welcome to invite family members as well. It's helpful for us to know who is being invited so that if a student, if a caregiver enters the meeting, we know to invite them in. So telling us in advance that you have someone else to come is very helpful for us on our side. A general education teacher will be there. A special education teacher will be there. The related service providers may be there. Depends on your child's growth areas and areas of service. So an example may be the school social worker, the school psychologist, the speech language pathologist, the occupational therapist, the physical therapist. We might have orientation and mobility. We might have vision services, we might have translation services. So it really depends on specifically the need of your child. A school district administrator will always be there, so someone to chair the meeting will be there. The principal might be there as well, depending on the need or the relationship. We invite the students when appropriate, and we love students to join us. So secondary level, they're invited to the meeting. We certainly want them to learn to advocate for themselves, and it really is their meeting, so we want to hear. So there are times we'll have a first grader pop in and talk to us about what they're doing that's successful and sharing what their goals are for the next year. And then we'll also often see a school counselor, which is a guidance counselor, which traditionally has been called, but they are identified as school counselors because we may be talking about specific classes or transcripts as we prepare for graduation. Next slide. So before the meeting, I'm often asked, what do I prepare as I get ready for this meeting? So next slide. So this is what you should be receiving in advance of the meeting. So here in Beacon, your child is, there's a special education teacher or a related service provider identified for each student. And so if it's a special education teacher, you can expect to receive a draft of the IEP in advance of the meeting to review. That IEP will not have programs or related services on it. It will only have the PLEPs, which is the present levels of performance, and the goals and some management needs on that document, because the programs and related services would be discussed at the CSE meeting. So you should, in advance of the meeting, have some understanding as to what will be discussed, so you can prepare questions or ask someone in advance of the meeting. So there will be information about what services will be provided at the meeting. So you will hear at the meeting, we're going to recommend this program or this related service for the 25-26 school year. You will hear progress monitoring for the 24-25 school year. So for example, you might hear a speech language pathologist say, your child, whoever your child is able to demonstrate the TH sound in the initial position of words as a goal on the 24-25 document with 80% accuracy. They've achieved that goal, and now we are moving on to the medial position of words, which would be in the middle. You'll hear the same for special education if they're recognizing that the student has achieved the ability to master CVC words, so consonant, vowel, consonant. You'll hear that progress. And then what the goal will be for 25-26 and how it will be progress monitored during the 25-26 school year. Next slide. So what happens during the review? Next slide. So you can expect that there will be a discussion of your child's progress on current IEP goals, like I just mentioned. We'll look at recent evaluation data and classroom performance. So you may hear things like This is how your child is performing on an iReady assessment or in a math assessment, and how the student is receiving support in the classroom. The teacher or the related service provider will identify new needs or concerns. So these are some areas that need to be improved upon in the next school year. There will be a determination of appropriate services, accommodations, and placement. So for example, you may hear your child will receive general education services and they'll receive accommodations of preferential seating. And preferential seating doesn't necessarily mean the front of the room. It just means where that student learns the best. And then documentation of all decisions on that IEP will be updated. Next slide. So when we discuss your child's strengths and challenges, next slide. These are some areas that will specifically be referenced in the meeting. So at the beginning of every meeting, when you enter as the parent or the guardian or the caregiver, we will ask you specifically, do you have any questions before we get started? Can you tell me how Sammy is doing at home? Can you tell me what Sammy still is struggling with at home? Are you doing homework? Is it easy? Is it hard? You'll hear those things asked to you, and we are interested in what your child is reporting to you too. How is Sammy talking about school? How is the bus ride going for Sammy? Those are things you can expect to hear. So we will be talking about your child's academic abilities and achievements and where they are according to their age. This is what the expectation would be for a 7-year-old. This is an expectation for a 14-year-old. We'll talk about their social skills and relationships. You'll hear things like, this is what's happening on the playground. This is what's happening in PE. We might have an art teacher in the meeting, and the art teacher will tell us about how the relationships are in art class. What are the specific interests and passions for your child? So your child may say, I want to be a singer when I grow up. And we are going to make plans, especially as they get older, to ensure that they've received the education they need to support that goal for themselves. So if you're a singer, we want to be sure that you're in chorus. We want to be sure that you have everything organized, that if you're in band, you're able to practice if those are your goals. We're going to look at what your child's communication style is. So does your child like to, be in a quieter setting? Do they become overwhelmed quickly? Do they need more movement breaks? How are they communicating their needs? Because not all communication is spoken. There are times we might see a student sitting in the back of the class and they're telling us that they just need space. So behavior is communication as well. We certainly want to talk about their independence and self-advocacy skills. And you'll see this if your student has some sort of support in the classroom. We want your student to become much more independent because we are looking for them to advocate for their needs in their environment. And not only just in school, but also advocate for their needs outside of school as well, whether they're playing soccer or whether they're in the grocery store. If they need help or they have a preference, we want to be able to ensure that they are able to express that information. And then we want them to have a growth mindset and persevere. So there are many things that we do as adults that are hard for us, and we want to be sure that children are learning that it's okay, we're learning together, we don't get it right every time, and we're going to keep working together. So if we're finding that there's a specific area that's difficult, we want to identify it very specifically. So if your child is having a harder time transitioning in the class from one room to the other, so let's say it's a 6th grade student and they're having what we would say is transitioning from one location to another, we want to be specific about what it is. Is it that your child having a hard time transitioning to math? Are they having a hard time transitioning to art? Is it just one area? Is it during a specific time of day? So we will look for those things and feedback from you. We will focus on observable behaviors and skills. So your child is able to complete all of their work in math, but they're having a harder time in ELA. So we would want to really see what is the barrier in that space so we can provide additional supports. We want to connect those challenges to potential solutions. So if in ELA, your child's having a harder time with the work, we want to see, do we need to break it into smaller groups, like smaller chunks? Do we need to give them a copy of the class notes? Do we need to give them additional assistive technology? Do we need to pair them with a peer? Anything that we can think about that we show success and student growth. We want to consider the environmental factors. We may have kiddos that are prefer to stand when they learn, or they may walk back and forth in the back of the classroom. So we want to consider those environmental factors as well and remove any barriers if there's a barrier in the learning environment. We want to discuss effective interventions. So, moving back and forth in the back of the class seems appropriate. But if it's a lab and there's glass everywhere and it's a science lab that the student is in, maybe that isn't the most effective intervention to keep your child safe. So we may provide them different seating arrangements where they might have a wobble chair or they might have a standing desk so that they aren't, so that they're in a space that's safe. And we want to maintain high but realistic expectations. So there are some students that we say, of course, we want them to attend for a full academic day, but that might be a too high an expectation for them and they may need breaks. Next slide. So what does progress measurement and celebrating growth look like? Next slide. So we want to know your observations from home. Like I said before, we want to know if your child is sleeping. We want to know what they're reporting about school. We will review the data that has been collected all year for your kiddo. We'll look at what the reading measurements are and the math measurements. We'll discuss academic performance and grades, like I said earlier. We will look at reports from the related service providers. So for example, if your child has vision services and we have orientation and mobility and we're looking at how the student is navigating the school building, we'll want to see that they're becoming more and more independent and navigating that space. And we'll talk about behavioral and social emotional progress. Next slide. So what are the present levels of performance? This is a very large part of the document. Next slide. So I'm going to break this down into 3 different parts for you. So let's talk about the first part. And this is where we really seek your input. So it's the academic achievement, functional performance, and learning characteristics. So there's 3 sections on the IEP for each of these areas. So the first is the levels of knowledge and development in that subject and skill area, including activities of daily living. So that'd be like brushing your teeth or your hair, level of intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior, expected rate of progress in acquiring skills, and information and learning style. So you will see it broken down maybe into speech, into math, into reading, into writing in that section. The next would be student strengths, preferences, and interests. And the third will be the areas of academics and consideration that are specifically of a concern to you as the parent. So you should expect in this document in the academic section that you will see in there feedback from you specifically about what your concern is for your child's academic growth. Next slide. So it's the same for social development. We'll be looking at the degree and quality of the student's relationships with peers and adults, feelings about self and social adjustment to school and community environments. Then we'll talk again about the student's strengths. For example, student is able to advocate effectively for their wants and needs, or student has many friends, student is a caring, kind individual. And then the last would be the social development that is of concern to you. So again, on the document, you should see something like parents report that they are concerned that Sammy hasn't been invited to birthday parties this year, or Sammy is playing soccer outside school and has difficulty when they get upset. And so we would want to address that in an appropriate manner for school. And so you may see a goal such as Sammy will regulate themselves when they become upset using such and such coping skill. Next slide. The third would be the physical development. So again, this is the degree or extent and quality of a student's motor and sensory development, including health, vitality, and physical skills or limitation which pertain to the learning process, what the strengths are, and then again, what your concerns are, and really celebrations too. So if your child has learned to ride a bike this year and we're celebrating that, we certainly want to know. Next slide. Goal setting. So every IEP will have a series of goals on it based on area of need. Next slide. So each goal will be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So an example would be when presented with new vocabulary in content area, then your child's name, will define the words and use them in sentences, and then here's your period. Criteria 3 of 4 over 5 weeks, using work samples, and scheduled would be quarterly. And you'll see that in each area of need. So you may see this in occupational therapy, you may see it in reading, you may see it in vision services or speech and language or any other that your child might need. Next one. Okay, so now let's talk about what the service decisions are. Next slide. So the services specifically on the document that are discussed at the meeting would be the type of instruction and support your child needs, how often your child receives those services, what the setting of those services will be, whether they be in the occupational therapy room, in the classroom, what related services your child might receive, any accommodations and modifications, so anything that needs to be changed in the environment, including what testing accommodations may be needed. If there's any assistive technology needs that is not, that's different than everybody else is receiving, and then if there is extended school year services recommended. Next slide. So let's talk about the least restrictive environment. We hear this often. So next slide, please. So the least restrictive environment is a key principle in special education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal law. It means that students with disabilities should be educated with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible, while still receiving the necessary supports and services to meet their unique needs. Next slide. So this is very general. Here are just some key aspects, and I'll just highlight them. So we always need to provide education for children in general education. So you may have a student who is in a classroom and receives speech and language services that might be inside the classroom or outside the classroom. But our first is making sure that children receive their education as close to their general education peers as possible. There are a continuum of placements. In this slide, I've only offered a few, but there's an entire New York State education document that has the full continuum. Your child may receive integrated co-teaching services. You may receive resource room, special classes, or specialized schools. And the specialized schools are outside of one of our 6 buildings, and they may be a school like Anderson Center for Autism or Center for Discovery or Hawthorne Cedar Knolls. Those are names you might hear. Then it's an individualized decision. So for example, your child may be recommended for integrated English, but no other service. That's the only area of need at this time. And we're required to work the continuum. So if the student's in general education and really having a hard time, we may have a special education teacher go work with the students or the class as well. And if the student continues to have a hard time, maybe we'll have a resource room added onto the document. So we are required to ensure that children remain with their peers as much as possible. And like I said before, supplementary aid and services, it could be assistive technology, could be teaching assistants in the classroom. There be maybe modifications to the curriculum to make it accessible. And the whole picture is we need to balance the individual's needs against the programs that are provided. So it may mean that your child does need additional supports outside the general education classroom, even if it's for an hour or 30 minutes, and we need to consider that as well. Next slide. So an example might be a student with a learning disability in reading might receive special instruction and resource room for part of the day, but stay in the general education classroom for the rest of the day in math and science. Or a student might have significant communication needs and might be in a special classroom, but with additional support, but participate in art, music, or physical education with their peers. Next slide. So a real highlighted success is from between 2019 to today. This is the percent of homeschool inclusion we've been able to provide and increase. So for example, in Glenham in 2019-2020, 65% of the children who had special needs in Glenham were receiving those programs at Glenham. Now we're up to 75%. Glenham is our school with the most, it's the highest enrollment. It has the most students with special needs in that building. So South has dramatically increased. They were at 38%. Now 52% of our children are receiving their education in that environment. JVS has gone from 34 to 59 and Sargent 42 to 65. So it's a real success for us. Next slide. So transition, I'll just go through this briefly. Next slide. So in New York State, transition services are provided to students when they turn 15 years old. We need to consider what they're going to do after high school. Next slide. So some key components of this is we need to look at what their strengths and preferences are, and we need to include that. Like I said before, if your child wants to become a singer, we're required to provide that information on the document, and how we can get that information is we interview your child and they give us that feedback as well as the teachers. Next slide. So here are some areas that we measure. These are long-term goals that are outlined in the document to support the student after high school. So for example, you'll see something about education and training. Is this child going to college, vocational training, or special skilled programs? How will they be employed? What kind of employment will they receive? And what is their intention as far as living? We've had children say that they want to live with their parents. We've had children say they want to move to Hawaii. It runs the gamut. Next. So the transition course of study, the student's educational program coursework must be aligned with the post-secondary goals. Like I said before, if your child says that they want to be a singer, we need to make sure that they're receiving that education in school and that they are taking the right classes to prepare for that learning. So if your child says that they want to be a doctor, we may ensure that they receive more science classes or higher level math, depending on what they say. Next slide. So the coordinated set of transition activities are designed to help the student move from school to after school. So post-life in school activities. So we will look at things such as their instruction, what related services do they need? What community experience should we be providing for them? Employment and post-school adult living. Do they need to, if they're seeking a driver's license, how do we help them with that assessment? If they're looking for employability, what does the resume look like? For daily living, do they need help budgeting? Do they need help understanding what cooking or a recipe might be? How do they use technology to support themselves? And then a functional vocational assessment if appropriate. Next slide. So what you can expect after the meeting. Next slide. You will receive minimally these 4 documents. You will receive a paper form of the individualized education program for your records. You'll receive something called the procedural safeguards, which you're required to receive, which are your rights as a parent and how to advocate for your children. You'll receive something called a prior written notice, which really summarizes what was said in the meeting and has all the meeting minutes in it, and just lets you know we had the meeting. You were in attendance, so you were likely hearing what was there, but it's a written documentation of what was said. And then something called an annual notification for Medicaid. It's just letting you know that if your child receives related services, we'll likely be submitting that information to the state. Does not affect you at all. Next slide. So what you should do is please review that finalized IEP document carefully. We make mistakes. We try really hard not to. We have a lot of people that do checks here to make sure it's all clean, but we just want to make sure that it's a right document. We want you to share the relevant information with your child. Each child is different. Each need is different. So share appropriately what you feel like, the goals, what the teachers have said, what you have said, what they wanted us to know. You want to communicate these key points to other family members as well. So your child may be receiving support from an extended family member after school, and it would be helpful to share with them, these are some things that your child is working on if they need support in, let's say, their homework after school. You're going to monitor the progress on the new goals for the next school year, and you'll receive that information when the report card comes. So you should expect that the goals that your child is working on, you will receive reports as to how they're doing throughout the year. You want to keep your documents organized. If you move, you might want to have that document for the next school district you go to. I will also say we keep documents here, all of the documents here. So if you need something again, we'll happily provide that for you. And please reach out with any questions or concerns. Next slide. So here are some resources. I did put the links in here, so we'll have to share that with you later. But there's a resource guide from the New York State Education Department for parents of individuals with disabilities. And then there's the procedural safeguard notice, which you will receive from us at the annual review time. So you expect to either get that hard copy in the mail or through the collaboration portal. Next slide. And as always, we are here to help you. It is a very busy time of year for us because we have, over 500 meetings that we will hold. So if you feel like, I finished the meeting and I'm just not sure, I had another question, please reach out to your child's teacher and ask those questions. There are school psychologists, there are other related service providers that can provide you with that clarity. If it's the document and you're not sure if there's a mistake or you're noticing something was wrong, please reach out to this department directly so we can ensure that the document is correct. My information is here. Again, my name is Dr. Heather Chadwell Dennis. I am the Assistant Superintendent for Pupil Services. The direct extension for Joan is 2015. And then my email address is chadwelldennis, dennis.h@beaconk12.org. So I want to thank you for participating today. Again, this will be recorded, so if you want to reference it later, you're welcome to do so. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to our department directly, and please be safe this evening. Thank you again, Mike, for helping.